In the autumn of 1847, when the leaves turned copper and gold across the rolling hills of Massachusetts, there stood a grand brick building that would become both sanctuary and prison for the most vulnerable souls of New England. Thornhill Asylum rose from the earth like a Gothic cathedral, its ivy-covered walls and arched windows promising hope to families desperate for answers. The asylum was the vision of Dr. Edmund Whitmore, a man of medicine who believed that troubled minds could be healed through proper care and understanding. He had studied in Europe, where new methods of treating mental ailments were beginning to take root. When he returned to America, he brought with him revolutionary ideas about compassion and healing. Dr. Whitmore hired Sister Margaret O'Brien to oversee the care of the children's ward. She was a woman of quiet strength, with gentle hands and patient eyes that seemed to understand suffering without judgment. The townspeople whispered that she had once lost a child of her own, though she never spoke of it. Perhaps this loss had given her the special tenderness needed to care for young minds that had been broken by the world. The first children to arrive at Thornhill came from families who had nowhere else to turn. There was Sarah Mitchell, barely 8 years old, who had stopped speaking after witnessing a terrible accident. Young Thomas Bell, who saw shadows that weren't there and spoke to voices only he could hear. Emma Grace, who had rocked back and forth for hours, humming melodies that seemed to come from another world entirely. Sister Margaret welcomed each child as if they were her own. She created routines that brought comfort: morning prayers in the sunlit chapel, afternoon walks through the gardens, and evening story time by the fireplace in the common room. The children wore simple, modest clothing, dark dresses with white collars for the girls and dark trousers with white shirts for the boys. It was uniform, but it was clean and warm, and for many of these children, it was the first time they had known such care. For nearly 3 years, Thornhill Asylum seemed to be fulfilling Dr. Whitmore's dream. Children who had been violent became calm. Those who had been mute began to whisper, then speak. The community started to believe that perhaps troubled minds could indeed be healed with kindness and understanding. But the world outside Thornhill was changing. Economic troubles swept across New England, and funding for the asylum began to dwindle. Dr. Whitmore found himself facing impossible choices. He could no longer afford the staff he needed, the food the children deserved, or the medicines that helped keep their minds stable. In the winter of 1850, something shifted within the walls of Thornhill. The children, who had once shown such promise, began to retreat back into themselves. Sarah Mitchell stopped eating. Thomas Bell's hallucinations returned with frightening intensity. Emma Grace's humming became a constant, haunting sound that echoed through the corridors day and night. Sister Margaret noticed the changes first. She saw how the children would stand at the windows, staring out at the snow-covered grounds with expressions of profound sadness. They began to gather together in groups, as if seeking comfort in numbers. When she approached them, they would turn to look at her with eyes that seemed far older than their years. The staff that remained grew nervous. Attendants reported strange sounds in the night, the soft padding of small feet in empty hallways, whispered conversations in rooms that should have been vacant. The children had developed their own silent language, communicating with glances and gestures that the adults couldn't understand. Dr. Whitmore, desperate to save his failing institution, made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his days. He began accepting children who were not merely troubled but genuinely dangerous. Children who had been involved in unexplained deaths, who exhibited behaviors so disturbing that their own families feared them. These new arrivals brought with them a darkness that seemed to seep into the very walls of Thornhill. The original children, who had been healing, began to change. Their gentle whispers became urgent murmurs. Their sad expressions hardened into something more calculating. Sister Margaret found herself caught between her duty to all the children, in her care, and her growing fear of what Thornhill was becoming. She watched as young Sarah Mitchell, who had been so close to recovery, began teaching the newer children games that involved disturbing rituals. Thomas Bell's voices were no longer random hallucinations. They seemed to be giving him specific instructions. On a particularly cold February night in 1851, Sister Margaret made her evening rounds as usual, but as she walked through the dormitories, she realized that something was terribly wrong. The children were not in their beds. Instead, they were all standing in the main hallway, arranged in perfect formation. They stood in 2 rows. The smaller children in front, the older ones behind. Their faces were serene, almost peaceful, but their eyes reflected a knowledge that no child should possess. In the center of the group stood a figure that Sister Margaret did not recognize, a child who seemed to shimmer in the lamplight, whose presence made the very air feel heavy and cold. Sister Margaret, Sarah Mitchell spoke for the first time in months, her voice clear and strong. "We've been waiting for you." The nun felt her heart racing, but she forced herself to remain calm. "Children, it's time for bed. Please return to your dormitories." But they didn't move. Instead, they began to speak in unison, their voices creating a harmony that was both beautiful and terrifying. They spoke of things that children shouldn't know, of the pain that had brought them to Thornhill, of the darkness that lived in the hearts of the adults who were supposed to care for them, of secrets hidden in the asylum's records. As Sister Margaret listened, she began to understand. These children had not been broken by the world, they had been chosen by it. They had been sent to Thornhill not to be healed, but to serve a purpose that was far greater and more terrible than anyone had imagined. The realization that came to her in that moment was both devastating and strangely comforting. The children were not lost souls needing salvation, they were guardians of something ancient and necessary. They had found each other at Thornhill, and together they had become something more than the sum of their individual traumas. In the months that followed, the townspeople noticed that Thornhill Asylum had grown quiet. No more reports of strange sounds or disturbing behavior reached their ears. Dr. Whitmore continued his work, but he seemed different, calmer, more accepting of his situation. Sister Margaret remained at the asylum until her death many years later. Those who knew her said that in her final years, she had found a peace that had long eluded her. She spoke often of her children, and how they had taught her that healing sometimes came not from changing what was broken, but from accepting what was necessary. The asylum continued to operate for another 30 years. And in all that time, it maintained a reputation for unusual tranquility. Children who entered its doors seemed to find exactly what they needed, though it was not always what their families had expected. When Thornhill finally closed in 1881, the building stood empty for only a short time before it was transformed into a school for gifted children. The new residents often reported feeling watched over by unseen presences. But it was a comforting sensation, as if benevolent spirits were ensuring their safety and success. To this day, the brick building stands on its hill, ivy still climbing, its walls, its arched windows still reflecting the changing seasons. And sometimes, on very quiet nights, passers-by claim they can hear the faint sound of children's voices, not crying or calling for help, but singing softly together in perfect, eternal harmony.